Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lillian Lodge Copenhaver, Executive Director of the Lillian Lodge Copenhaver Center for the Advancement of Women in Communication in the School of Journalism and Mass Communication here at Florida National University. I am delighted to welcome you this afternoon to our national conference on equity and equality of the sexes in communication, Are Women Getting There? We have an exciting and enlightening program planned for you this afternoon. I know you are aware that women make up 51% of the population of the United States. It is therefore very important that communications in this country represent the population equitably, both in the information that is delivered, as well as in those who deliver that information. Only in this way can we protect and defend our democratic society. The mission of the Copenhaver Center is to empower both women professionals and academics in all of the fields of communication in order to develop visionaries and leaders who can make a difference in their communities and in their professions. Our conference today will provide us with an opportunity to explore the reality of the role and status of women in communication and chart a pathway to help women realize their potential and become those visionaries and leaders of tomorrow. I would like to give a special thanks to the sponsors of this conference today. Connie Silver, PhD. Connie, would you stand, please? Virgil Smith of the Smith-Edwards Group in Atlanta. The Miami Herald, and Mindy Marquez is with us, as well as two other of her colleagues. WPLG, Channel 10. Anybody here from Channel 10? Well, we'll give them applause anyway. And of course, our own Public Relations Student Society of America, and Solange, the president of the group, is in the back. Thank you, Solange, for hosting this event today. It's now my pleasure to introduce Brian Schreiner, Dean of the School of Journalism and Mass Communication and the College of Architecture and the Arts. Brian?
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
How are you? Thank you, Dr. Copenhaver. So it's my pleasure to be here this afternoon on behalf of the FIU President, Dr. Mark Rosenberg, and the FIU Provost, Dr. Ken Furton. I want to welcome you. Also, our Vice Provost of Biscayne Bay Campus is here, Steve Mall. Could you please rise and be recognized? There isn't anything that happens on the beautiful Biscayne Bay campus that Mr. Mall doesn't have his hand in. So we're grateful that he's here. I also want to extend a special welcome to our FIU students, faculty, and staff. Could you rise and be recognized, the faculty and staff and students? Also, our panelists who are going to be here, members of the community, and again, thank all of the sponsors, and the Lillian Lodge Copenhaver Advisory Board. Could the Advisory Board please rise and be recognized? Thank you. Also, a special welcome to our keynote speaker that you'll learn a little bit more about in a moment, Susan Goldberg. Susan? Susan is the editorial director of National Geographic Partners and the editor-in-chief of National Geographic Magazine. I want to close my thank yous by again thanking Dr. Copenhaver. The center bears her name for her leadership. This center is positioned to be a national voice, perhaps the national voice, with respect to their core mission, which is empowering success and diversifying leadership. I was fortunate enough to attend the board meeting this morning, and there's two things that I picked up on that I believe this center will become the national voice for and be a centerpiece for the School of Journalism and Mass Communication and for the university as a whole. And that's one, research, which is the study of gender inequalities in communication. And we're here this afternoon to learn a little bit more about the research the center is doing and what that means, not just for Miami, but for women across the country. and as a solution center. FIU has positioned itself within the country as being a solution center, and this center has that capability of being a solution center for the advancement of women in the fields of communication through mentorship and sponsorship, and importantly, the development of visionary leaders in the communication profession. So it's with great pleasure, again, I welcome you. A special thank you to Dr. Copenhaver for making this possible, and on behalf of the entire university community, welcome.
It's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker today, Susan Goldberg. Susan is Editorial Director of National Geographic Partners and Editor-in-Chief of National Geographic Magazine. As Editorial Director, she's in charge of all publishing ventures, including digital journalism, magazines, books, maps, children and family, and travel and adventure, so she has a big portfolio. She was named Editorial Director in October of 2015 and Editor-in-Chief of the magazine in April 2014. She is the 10th editor of the magazine since it was first published in October 1888, and its first woman editor. Under her leadership, in 2015, National Geographic Magazine won 2 National Magazine Awards and the George Polk Award for magazine reporting. In March 2015, she received the Exceptional Woman in Publishing Award from Exceptional Women in Publishing. Before her employment at National Geographic, Goldberg was executive editor for federal, state, and local government coverage for Bloomberg News in Washington. She started at Bloomberg in 2010. In 2013, she was voted one of Washington's 11 most influential women in the media by Washingtonian Magazine. From 2007 to 2010, she was editor of the Cleveland Plain Dealer, the largest newspaper in Ohio. Prior to that, from 2003 to 2007, she was the executive editor of the San Jose Mercury News and served as the paper's managing editor prior to that. She also worked at USA Today as a deputy managing editor of the News, Life, and Enterprise sections. And she was a reporter and editor at the Detroit Free Press. She began her career as a reporter at the Seattle Post-Intelligencer. So she's had a very, very long career in journalism. A Michigan native, Goldberg has a bachelor's degree in journalism from Michigan State University, where she now funds the Susan Goldberg Scholarship in the School of Journalism. She is active in professional journalism organizations, and in 2012-2013, she was president of the American Society of News Editors. She's on the boards of the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press and the College of Communication, Arts, and Sciences at MSU, and previously was co-chair of the Medill School of Journalism's Board of Visitors at Northwestern University. She also is on the board of the National Museum for Women in the Arts in Washington and is a member of the International Women's Forum. It is my pleasure and honor to present Susan Goldberg.
Well, thank you, Dr. Copenhaver. It is a pleasure to be here with you all today at the Center, the Copenhaver Center for the Advancement of Women in Communication. Now, I know everybody who stands up here says how pleased they are to be here, but in fact, I am happier than you could really know. I spent all of last week at the hospital, where my husband underwent emergency open heart surgery. And so now he has a scar from here to here, and let us just say his bathing suit modeling days are behind him, but he will be just fine. But when any of us goes through something like this, it does force us, each of us, to really take stock about our priorities, about how we spend our time, about how happy or unhappy we are with our lives on your average Tuesday. So as I sat around that hospital room, I thought about my husband and the life that we've built, and I felt enormous gratitude. I also thought about my career and how humbled and astonished I am to have had the many opportunities that I have. But in that room with the beeping equipment and under those really harsh hospital lights, I read the results of the national survey that you've done on women communications professionals. I read how women in communications are 3 times less likely than men to have a top management job. How many women cite a men-only organizational culture for being passed over for a better job. How there's growing evidence that when women start entering a profession in substantial numbers, those professions start paying less, even controlling for education, work experience, and skills. So I sat there and I thought about my time and my priorities, and really outside of my family, I just have 2. First, I'm a fighter for journalism that makes a difference. And just as important, I'm a fighter for there to be an equal playing field on which everyone, regardless of sex, race, ethnicity, or gender identification, can practice it. I've spent 35 years as a proud evangelism of journalism that matters, whether it was working to expose wrongdoing and injustice, helping people become better participants in their communities, or simply providing people with the knowledge that allowed them to look at their lives and the world in new ways. Today, I feel more strongly than ever that all of us in journalism and communication can have more impact and reach more people than at any time in our history. At National Geographic, our unique brand of storytelling reaches 60 million magazine readers in 35 languages. We reach nearly 500 million television viewers in 171 countries, and 250 million people who interact with us on social media. It's hard to find a brand that's more trusted or more authentic. It's meaningful to people from 8 to 80. So I am 100% confident that we can create stories that make a difference to our readers and viewers now and into the future. But I've also spent 3 decades fighting for women and our place in our proud profession. Ever since I became the first woman that the Detroit Free Press sent to the state capital to cover the governor and the legislature in 1984. Now, how ridiculous is it that that happened in 1984 as opposed to 1954 or 1934? But ever since 1984, I've really thought a lot about the forces that have made it difficult for women to succeed in our craft. Every day I think about this, and every day I think about what we can do to make it better. So over the years, we've gotten a lot of advice on how to change this. Work twice as hard as the guys. Fake it till you make it. Don't be afraid to fail. Lean in. I'm sure I speak for many of us who've been leaning in for a lifetime, sometimes so far in that we've toppled over right onto our faces. So in response, I've done what women always do. We got up, we dusted ourselves off, and we tried once again to find that elusive career fulcrum. It's not that I object to the lean-in concept. It's just that after watching the challenges faced by women in 7 major news organizations, I don't think it's the right metaphor to explain what ails us in the workplace. The problem isn't the direction of the lean. It's the precariousness of the balance. How easy it is to fall over, forward or backward, while practicing journalism while female. How easy it is to be labeled bossy and pushy and difficult for the same behaviors that make men leaders, assertive and decisive. This is why we begin with a significant majority of young women graduating from journalism and communications schools, and a generation later end up with a significant minority of middle-aged women leading newsrooms. The figures are startling. 64% of all graduates from journalism and mass communication schools are female, and 23% of journalism leaders are female. 64% to 23%. That's like falling off a cliff. Don't let anybody tell you this is a pipeline problem. So as I examine where we are with women's leadership across our professional landscape, I feel conflicted. I feel pride in the strides so many women have made. Just look around this room. And yet, I'm mad. I'm mad there are far fewer women running newspapers, big or small, than there were 10 years ago. I'm mad that digital media companies, which had the opportunity to upend decades of discriminatory hiring and promotion practices at legacy institutions, instead seem largely to reflect the most sexist part of the technology industry crossed with the most sexist part of the old media industry. I'm mad that every time a woman gets a big job or loses a big job in publishing, it's a national news story, because it's still all such an anomaly. I'm mad that in a time of enormous disruption and change in media, a circumstance that is going to exist for the rest of our careers, support for women's leadership has devolved into "you go girl" sloganeering and very little actual help. And I'm mad that last year I got this email from a woman who covers sports. She said, "I've been up for 2 major columnist gigs, and I've been told at one that I would be perfect for the market, I would be perfect for the job, but the market wasn't ready for a female voice on sports. And at the other, I was asked if I was going to have kids and not work for a while. The publisher was concerned about that. Both jobs went to men. I can't even count how many of us have been asked about these things on interviews. If you're single, they're concerned you're a lesbian. If you're married, they're concerned you have kids. If you have kids, they're concerned you won't be available to work or travel. They don't worry if the guys are married or single or have kids, because they're assumed to have a wife or partner at home to take care of everything. And plus, being single and out there is kind of cool for a male sports writer. It fits with the macho stereotype with the athletes." So all of this adds up to me being pretty mad, which is a dangerous word to use lest I be labeled emotional or in the vice grip of PMS, even if I still had the M. So I'm going to talk for a minute about how I think we can channel this anger into creating truly equitable workplaces once and for all. But first, let me reflect briefly on a career that has been one surprise after another, and none bigger for me than landing at National Geographic as its first female editor in 128 years. It started with my dropping out of college. So after my junior year at Michigan State, and after 72 rejection letters, I finally landed a summer reporting internship at the Seattle Post-Intelligencer. 7 weeks into the job, the editor came over to my desk. "So, kid," he said, "do you want to stay?" Oh, yes, more than anything. Then I had to do the hardest thing. I called my father, who was a professor at the University of Michigan. "Pop," I said, "I'm quitting college and moving to Seattle to work as a full-time reporter." There was a silence, a very long silence. And then my father said the 8 words I least expected him to say. "Good for you," he said. "We're very proud of you." And so my career began. It was 1980, and looking around at the big newspapers where I wanted to work, there were almost no women in charge. I could not possibly have foreseen what would happen, that I'd end up being the first woman managing editor of the San Jose Mercury News, then the paper's first female editor. Then I became the first female editor of the Cleveland Plain Dealer. Now, those firsts sometimes were comical if they weren't also really so sad. In Cleveland, for example, my hiring had been a well-kept secret. So unbeknownst to me, the publisher decided to make a dramatic announcement to the staff, and he decided that he was going to walk me down an open-air staircase in the middle of the newsroom. It was sort of like a bad wedding. So there I was with him on one side of me and the banister on the other, holding on for dear life and praying not to become another first. The first female editor of Ohio's largest newspaper to fall down the stairs in her slingback heels in front of hundreds of people. But as I got closer to the bottom of the stairs, I heard this murmuring. "It's a girl, it's a girl, it's a girl," was sweeping through the crowd. People were truly shocked. And I'm sorry to say the women in the room seemed the most shocked of all. But our girl parade wasn't over. After a few months in Cleveland, I hired a woman to be my managing editor, the first woman to hold that job. Then I hired a woman to be our editorial page editor, the first woman to hold that job. So this meant the 3 top journalists at Ohio's largest newspaper all were women. It might be some sort of weird record. So one night I went to a community meeting and a man politely raised his hand. I gave him a big smile because I figured he was going to ask me about the award-winning journalism we were doing to expose terrible, rampant corruption in the county government. What he said was, "Are you running a hen house over there?" But for all of this, for the slights and the put-downs and the ways we get underestimated and talked over, my career's biggest struggles haven't been gender-based, at least not obviously. Instead, they've been dealing with what life, technology, and the economy put in my path. In our business, this has meant coping with drastic change, as absolutely everything about storytelling has been upended for the last 20 years, from the way we report and disseminate information to the painfully slow reinvention of the business model that supports our news gathering mission. You know, I've heard it said that people often overestimate the rate of change and underestimate its long-term impact. Neither is true in media today. Without a doubt, this is the most exciting, terrifying, and transformative time since the invention of the printing press. And that's also why this is the perfect time, amid all this tumult, to create the kind of workplaces where women can succeed. So, admittedly, we start with a litany of problems: underrepresentation at the top, barriers to hiring, cultural stereotyping, family issues, pay issues, confidence issues. I wish it were a shorter list. But what do? Here are 7 ideas. First, we know that the progress women made in the workplace in the last decades of the 20th century have stalled in some areas, especially representation in top management and on corporate boards. So we need to stay on top of the numbers. Look at your own workplace. Know what's going on there. How in or out of whack is your business when it comes to women in leadership and next up positions? Do a personnel audit. Pound away at the empirical evidence. What you measure is what you value. Second, we can't wage this fight alone. We need to make sure the men in our offices, whether they are our colleagues or our bosses, feel included in these discussions, invested in the outcome, and not the object of some anti-man crusade. Convincing the company CEO to adopt this issue is key, and yes, most of them are men. So figure out how to get the boss to make successful and abundant female leadership a measure of his own success. In the leadership structure at National Geographic Partners, there are 8 top jobs. 5 are held by women. Third, imagine if each of us who've been around for a while identified a young woman who showed great promise. Imagine if we helped her see herself as a leader. Recently, I was on a panel with Carolyn Ryan, who's one of the top political editors at the New York Times, and she made this very point. We all have pictures in our heads about what leadership looks like. So to those of us who grew up in the newspaper business at a certain time, that picture looks a lot like Ben Bradley standing on a desk with his shirt sleeves rolled up, inspiring the troops. Well, as Carolyn noted, she's not climbing on any desk. And her conclusion was this: these days, leadership wears a lot of faces, body types, and heel heights. We need to remind our younger colleagues and ourselves that the picture of what leadership used to look like is not what it is going to look like. Next, each of us lucky enough to make hiring decisions needs to do our part. Getting a more diverse workforce doesn't happen by accident. It is an intentional effort, job by job, to change the composition of our workforces. We all know this is true, and it starts by making sure that for every single position, we have a diverse pool of qualified candidates. Now, this also applies to bylines and people who are quoted in news stories. At National Geographic, we did a study, and I wasn't happy with the results. We found that about 8 of every 10 major stories in the center of the magazine, the major feature stories, was written by a man in 2015. That's why in 2016, half of the writers that we have hired so far to do those major stories have been women. And so we are going to change the composition of the people who are reporting our stories. Now, fifth, we have to talk about this. Yes, we also have to talk about growing our businesses and reinventing for the future and reaching new audiences. But we just can't let this fall off the table again. We let ourselves get used to seeing relatively few women in charge. And then we got used to shutting up about it because we were told we had bigger problems to solve. I no longer buy this argument. Diverse workplaces with diverse leadership are more successful as businesses. It's really that simple. Sixth, we need to call out instances of vastly different allowable behaviors. Now, if a male leader can punch a wall or kick a wastebasket, a female leader ought to be able to do that too, right? Can you imagine? No, I can't either. And while I really don't think that anybody should be punching or kicking anything in a newsroom, it demonstrates how far we are in parity from acceptable leadership styles. You know, like they say at the airport, if you see something, say something. Finally, the You Go Girl chorus, when women are hired, needs to become actual support for them once they're in place. We need to give women the same freedom to make mistakes that the men have, because women leaders are going to make mistakes, just like the guys do. But the women's mistakes, they'll be more public and more harshly judged. Leading any organization is difficult. Female leaders have their day job, and they have to deal with this hidden pressure as well. So we need to help them. Okay, so that's my to-do list, and I am trying to work on it point by point as I live out my day-to-day life at National Geographic as the person in charge. So let me close with this. In this era of disruption, there's a lot we can't be sure of, a lot we simply can't know. But there is one thing we do know. There is no justification for opportunity that's not equal, pay that's not commensurate with the work, treatment that's preferential or discriminatory. I'd like to leave you with a profound and challenging statement from a wise woman. Gloria Steinem once said that God is in the details, but the goddess is in the questions. So journalism is about asking the right question in the right place at the right time. And here's my question for you. What are we waiting for? Thank you very much. I would be very happy to take any questions. I can maybe mess around with this microphone. Okay, here we go. About anything? Okay.
My question is about what young women now in communications can do to make sure that when they do get into workplace, they aren't discriminated against, and if they feel like they are being discriminated against, how they can speak up. For example, I worked for an insurance company, and they were around for 15 years. They had only hired one female manager out of the dozens of male managers they had hired, and when I kept on asking why, they said, we need to find the right woman. We haven't found the right woman. And for the male managers, they didn't have to be good. They just had to have a personality. But the woman they hired was the top salesperson in the entire office. So what can women do when they are in the workplace and they notice there's discrimination? How should they address it?
Well, you know, the "we can't find any women" excuse is so lame. It really almost doesn't get any worse than that. Because actually there are lots of women who are as qualified or even more qualified. When you look at, you know, who's getting degrees and who's graduating from colleges and graduate schools, there's way more women than men. You know, I think how to deal with it is probably a very individual situation. I guess the situation that you just described, I might not want to work at that place. You know, you can complain, you can go to management, but if there is a culture that absolutely will not allow women to thrive, I would try to look somewhere else. Yeah.
You mentioned that men have to be a part of the conversation. I was asking, how do you bring the men into the conversation in National Geographic? Because I find it hard sometimes to get men interested in this, even men.
Okay, so the question is how do we bring men into the conversation? I think the first thing is it really shouldn't be a confrontational conversation, but I think we can, you know, there's plenty of evidence out there that having a more diverse workforce creates a better workforce and a better bottom line result. And I think that, you know, people are swayed by the numbers and by, you know, you would wish that everybody would want to do what's right and what's fair, but sometimes you just have to argue the numbers. And so I think arguing the numbers and, you know, demonstrating the facts is really the best way to have the conversation, at least as a starting point. You know, most men have mothers, sisters, daughters, somebody. And so I do think that people do want to create opportunities for women. Smart people know that you can't, you know, take half of the society and not use them to their full potential in workplaces and still be successful. So I think that you argue it as a numbers thing, you argue it as a moral right, and then you can just appeal to them on a personal basis. I actually haven't had any trouble getting men involved in that conversation. I have found, and especially even younger men, seem more and more inclined to get it.
When you found out about the disparity on the stories, did you make an announcement or you just changed without saying anything?
So the question was, when I found out about the disparity of the stories, you know what we did? We had a staff meeting. We put all the numbers up on the board because I think it's really important to be transparent about it. And I wanted to get everybody's attention that, hey, we have a problem here in who, you know, in our byline parity. And, you know, I'm not going to create a quota system, but we need to do a much better job looking for qualified female writers to write the kinds of stories that we want to run in National Geographic. Interestingly, for our digital stories, the ones that we're writing just for online, we do not have this problem at all. But for some of these longer magazine stories, we did have the problem. And I think sharing that information and talking about it and having meetings about it, super important. That's how to get people involved.
Question. So you had mentioned when you were at the Cleveland Plain Dealer and coming down the stairs and everything, and the women's reaction. So what do you do in getting women behind you? Sometimes that can be equally as difficult, if not more so, than getting men behind you.
I actually think the women were just shocked because it had been such a male culture at the Plain Dealer, kind of a macho swaggering place, like a lot of newspapers were. So they were really quite shocked. But I don't think that shock represented any kind of dismay. I think they were shocked in a good way. And I found that the women at the Plain Dealer were enormously supportive of having a woman in charge. I've actually not really run into any issue with women having a problem with a woman leader. In fact, much the opposite. I have felt very supported by my colleagues who are male and female.
Hi.
Hi.
Ruth Bader Ginsburg has recently been quoted as, when she was asked how many women should be on the Supreme Court, she said, all of them. And when the reporter expressed distress over this, she said, well, nobody seemed to care when it was all men. When you talk about quotas, I was reminded when you were talking about quotas of this, because what is the right balance? I mean, 50-50 seems too easy to me, and I would like you to expand on that a little.
Well, when I think about how I've tried to handle it in, you know, the places that I've worked, I've looked for parity. So I've looked for basically parity with the populations that in newspapers this was a simple thing. So if, you know, I worked for the Plain Dealer, you know, I want to make sure we've got a very healthy representation of African American staffers, you know, reporters and managers, because there's a large African American community there. And, you know, we've got to have people who represent every viewpoint, who can see the stories, because the story I see as a 56-year-old Jewish woman from the Midwest is going to be very different from the story that a 25-year-old Asian guy sees, or 35-year-old Latina, or a black man who's 60. So that is why we need to have these diverse staffs. In newsrooms, it creates storytelling that is going to be more accurate about what's actually going on in those communities. But, I mean, I don't think I need to have an all-female newsroom or all-female editors or all-female anything, really. I just want it to be a place where women feel like they can succeed, where men feel like they can succeed, and the numbers are roughly right to the population.
Well, I have another question. So my stepfather's from Norway, and I spoke to him about this, and he said in Norway, in the public sector, they passed a law where 40% of the women, 40% of board members in the public sector have to be women, and if they don't comply, then they can be shut down. And he said at first people were really upset, but then it really helped Norway and diversified many companies and helped their economy. Do you think that maybe we should adopt in America something similar, where businesses should be forced to have some sort of quota to get used to the idea of having women in leadership?
I've been to some conferences where this has come up quite a bit about public company representation on the boards. This is a little bit above my pay grade, I think. But I personally don't want to do that. But I understand the intellectual argument for doing that. But I think as a practical matter, even though that happened in Norway, I have a lot of trouble imagining that actually happening in the United States. I think we're a very different country with some very different ideas about it. But what I think really should happen is that those public companies ought to feel pushed, shamed, encouraged, whatever it takes to have significant female representation on their boards. It is a slower process, but I think at the end of the day, if it isn't some mandated thing, that it ends up, you end up in a better place. But that's just my opinion. Reasonable people are really going to disagree about this.
I have a question regarding photojournalism in photographers. Are you looking at parity as well in that field?
So I didn't want to spend all day here on National Geographic, but the truth is we have a lot more. So most of our photographers are contract photographers. We only have 2 photographers who are actually on our staff of National Geographic. One happens to be a man, one happens to be a woman. But the contract photographers that we use, many more of them are men. And it's quite interesting, and we've been exploring why that is. And one of the reasons is, for whatever reason, there are a lot fewer women who photograph natural history. So many of the subjects we do. Where we have the most success finding women photographers are for our culture stories, even for our conflict stories. There are female war photographers, conflict photographers. We just had a wonderful story on women in Saudi Arabia that was shot by Lindsay Addario, who is a very well-known female photographer. I mean, we use female photographers all the time, but we still do have more men, and it is something that the photo director of National Geographic and I talk about all the time, and I have a lot of support from her in this. Her name is Sarah Lean.
Hi, I have a question about, you mentioned the leadership and the success, and you had not had situations in which there were women in leadership positions or even in communities of work that had been against or opposed or not supportive. My question is related to your experience as a leader and as a woman. How much have you encountered, or have you encountered, are women, or let me just change it, the question, are women at your level, let's say, of leadership and success, having the promotion of women a must, a priority, a huge priority, or are they just going with the flow, and of course, by that, advocating women in leadership positions, but not as a larger promoter type of priority?
I mean, I would hope that anybody would look at my record and what I've done and say, I've been a huge promoter of putting women into leadership positions. And I think that would be a fair assessment. You know, everybody's going to be different. And I think as a leader, you're always going to have your supporters and you're going to have your detractors, and some of them are going to be women and some of them are going to be men. And, you know, you've got to manage for the whole company. But I think it is really important to have those diverse viewpoints and have all of the voices in the room and at the table, and that we do a disservice to the overall quality of, you know, whatever we're trying to produce, whether it's a magazine or, you know, or whether you're running a legal office. It is a real disservice not to have that diverse leadership and those diverse staffers. Oh.
Whoops. Hi. Okay, so my question is, do you have any advice as far as dealing with like gatekeepers? My friend's supposed to come here, but she had a prior engagement, and she's kind of going through that right now. Right now, she's doing a lot of broadcasting projects, and the broadcast professor at first was like, you should go for this job at NPR. And this was yesterday. And then this morning, she calls me and she's like, yeah, apparently he changed his mind. He says that I'm not capable of it because he looked at the job description and they were looking for like, you know, 2 to 5 years experience. And, you know, his statement was like, well, I'm trying to protect you from like rejection and stuff like that. So again, how do you deal with those kind of gatekeepers?
That's really annoying.
I know.
All right. I mean, you know, we don't need to be protected from anything, right? You don't need it. Nobody is helping you if they say, oh, they're protecting you from, you know, getting your feelings hurt or getting rejected. That is actually not help at all, because I think what we want are to be evaluated by our skills and our accomplishments and our experience. You know, my experience was getting the first job was the hardest. Getting 72 rejection letters really sucked. And I'll never forget it and what it was like. But once I finally was able to start, then you can prove what you can do, and you can show what you can do every day. And those gatekeepers, you don't have to worry as much about them because you're proving yourself every single day. I do think for the students in the room, it's that first job that's really the very toughest job to get. And you know, I'm sure as other hiring managers would agree, because you feel like when you're hiring somebody for the first time who's never really had, you know, a full-time job before, you feel like you're taking a bigger chance. And that's why I think internships are so important and why it's such a great way in the door. I really feel like when I look at my own career, I owe it all to what was supposed to be an 8-week summer internship, because it gave me a chance to prove what I could do. Yeah.
Sorry. Hi, sorry. My name is Camila Fernandez, and I'm a broadcast media student here at FIU. I was wondering, what advice in particular do you have for women in journalism that are minorities in the country?
I don't know that I have advice that is really any different. I mean, I think my first advice to any journalist at any level is be really great at what you do. You know, don't let anybody have an excuse not to hire you, right? Show what you can do, get that experience, get those clips, become an expert, you know, be able to tell stories across every platform so that you can meet readers where they are. I think in some ways it is very advantageous to be a young person getting into the profession right now, because digital natives totally get digital, right? In a way that I can study as hard as I want. It will never be in my bones the way it is for a number of you in this audience. And one of the really refreshing things we see in workplaces now that we never used to see is not only do we have the older people mentoring the younger people, you see a lot of younger people mentoring the older people on how to do stuff. And you're also experts at millennials, because you are millennials. And everybody wants to attract this new generation of readers and users to our content. So whether you're a minority, whether you're male, female, I just think you be really good and you make sure they know what you can do. That's my advice.
Hi. My name is Vilma, and I'm also a student here at FIU. I want to thank you for being here and for sharing your experience, also for your advices. My question is, it's very easy to fall into stereotypes, as you mentioned before. How would you handle a situation where someone is calling you feminist or, maybe taking the wrong direction, understanding that you're having the wrong intentions? Because I understand your intention is totally to have 50-50 or even 70 and 40 in the work field. But how will you handle that situation where people doesn't understand what you're doing?
If somebody calls me feminist, I say thank you. I mean, look, I don't see anything wrong with having people know that you are trying to create an equitable workplace where people of every kind of person can succeed, because that is what we need to do. And whether it's the law profession or banking or journalism, any profession, we need to have these equitable workplaces and diverse staffs. And so I'm happy, I talk about it all the time. I, show numbers. I want to have that conversation. And it seems like if we have somebody in the office that really has a problem with it, well, they don't have to work there. It's a free country. All right, well, I think we are probably out of time. Thank you so much. I appreciate all those questions.
Thank you, Susan. And we so appreciate your taking time away from your family after your husband's health crisis to come and join us. And we want you to know that it is certainly something that we all appreciate your advice. I think we could all just sit here all afternoon and just ask you questions. My name is Lisette Campos. I'm the Director of Community Affairs of the ABC station in Tampa, Florida. But most importantly, I am a very proud graduate of the School of Journalism here at Florida International University. So.